Coming up on Theater Talk.
And by the way, he cheated too. It's not that, he wasn't simply, in Hollywood, for instance, he would get involved with starlets because, what's that famous definition of a starlet in Hollywood? Any woman under the age of 25 who is not actively employed in a brothel. So there are a lot of starlets that Kurt Weill could meet and have, an adventure with.
Theater Talk is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation. From New York City, this is Theater Talk. I'm producer Susan Haskins.
And I'm Michael Riedel of the New York Post. One of the most fascinating relationships in the 20th century theater was that between Kurt Weill, the great composer, and his wife Lotte Lenya, one of the great performers. This relationship, which all of its complexity, has been dissected in a fine new book by our friend Ethan Mordden called Love Song: The Lives of Kurt Weill and Lotte Lenya. And I'm delighted that Ethan is here today to discuss this complex, somewhat disturbing, but ultimate love affair between these two. Is that not the case, do you think, Ethan?
I wouldn't call it disturbing. I would call it two fascinating people who were so intertwined in life and in art that the road is not going to be easy. But and they did at one point. She divorced him at one point.
That's right.
This is not very well known, and but they did remarry. And it's not. The legend is that they ran away from Nazi Germany, got into France, and then eventually came to America. They didn't leave together. She was having an affair with a tenor in another part of the world, kind of thing. But what's interesting is he knew that she would come back to him because their art was imperishable, and they really were two artists who were making one art, so to say. He says that whenever he wrote a song, he always heard it as he was writing it down on the music paper in her voice.
Wenn man fragt, wer wohl sterben muss, und da werden sie mich sagen hören, alle.
That's what he heard in his ear. And this was before she was really thought of as a singer.
Right.
Her reputation as a singer really comes from after his death in 1950, when she was persuaded, more or less at gunpoint, to go back on the stage and into the recording studio and keep his music alive.
That's right.
That's the Lotte Lenya we know. She wasn't thought of as a singer.
Where and when did they meet? And was it, as the old cliche says, love at first sight?
It wasn't at first sight because he was in the orchestra pit and she was auditioning and they couldn't see each other. But they wanted to, it was a dancing role because she was an actress and a dancer. And he was the composer of the Magic Night, is the name of the ballet. So he's in the orchestra pit, and they ask her to dance a little something, and she thinks she'll dance to the Blue Danube. And she calls out to whoever's in the pit, "Do you think you can get through that?" And he says, "Oh, I think I can." But they didn't see each other at all. Later on, she was an au pair for Georg Kaiser, the playwright, and Weill, who only wrote his operas and musicals with playwrights, because he didn't want to write the same old show every time. And if you get your standard librettist, standard lyricist kind of thing, well, actually there were exceptions, because he worked with Alan J. Lerner, for instance, but he mostly liked Brecht, Maxwell Anderson, Moss Hart, people who were playwrights, because they would not come up with the same old musical. In fact, they wouldn't come up with anything that had ever been seen before, and Weill always wanted each work to be different from each other work. So he's visiting the Kaiser family to work with Georg Kaiser on this opera, and the au pair is sent to pick him up at the station, and she takes the boat across the lake to meet him. This is the suburbs of Berlin. And the au pair is Lotte Lenya, because her work had dried up. And that's where they met. And she told many different versions of this. In one version, yes, it was love at first sight, and he proposed.
On the boat, on the way to...
On the way to, that's it. Well, but I have to say, she was one of those people with that kind of playful confidence that is so sexual,
right,
even as a subtext, so to say, that everyone just fell for her instantly.
Yeah.
She was, and he was the opposite. He was very withdrawn, very quiet. He was always thinking about his next melody. He was always planning his next... This is a man who seized his destiny in his short life, because he only lived 50 years.
Yeah.
He accomplished an incredible amount because he was always ready to write the next thing, and it drove him crazy that most of his collaborators wanted to go play golf, or wanted to go out drinking, or wanted to meet their friends at the Stammtisch, of the local.
Collect their nice big royalty checks, go on a nice long vacation.
Yeah, but of course you have to write the show first before you get the. What's amazing to me is he apparently got on very, very well with Alan J. Lerner, who was the laziest writer in town. If you remember, Richard Rodgers was originally supposed to write On a Clear Day, You Can See Forever with Lerner. That was the original teaming, but at one point they were supposed to meet to discuss the next song, and Lerner did not show up. And Rodgers called the house, and he was told, "Oh, Mr. Lerner has gone to Mexico," or wherever it was. He's gone to Spain. Didn't even bother to
believe
cancel.
that.
That's fooch, as Carval might say.
But take us back. So there are various versions that Lotte Lenya tells about this first meeting on the boat. He proposed right then and there. What other versions did she tell? And what do you believe to be?
It's impossible to know, because I think there's truth in every version that she tells. She was a great storyteller too. She loved to shock people at parties. For instance, there was, at least she says, there was a time in her teen years in Vienna, which is where she was from. She had gotten a job in a millinery, and she hated it. Already she knew she wanted to go on the stage, because she had performed in a little mom and pop circus, walking the trapeze. It was about yay high kind of thing with a little paper umbrella, and you're hooked. And and she didn't want to work in a millinery shop, and she had some friends who were selling on the street, and they said, "Why not? You can try it too. Men always love you." And so she says she joined them for a time.
Yeah, she was
claims
to have been a prostitute. Yeah.
Spending money is what it was about. That's all, spending money. And at parties later on in America, for instance, theatrical parties kind of thing, with the Gershwins would be there, or Catherine Cornell would be there, and she loved to tell these stories.
Well, you portray her throughout their lengthy relationship, which went until he died. She was constantly unfaithful. I mean, just a very active sex life, which is almost, well, number one, it's unbelievable that he put up with it, but that you've explained that, but it's just, it almost seems too much to be believed.
No, it's if you have a very strong sex drive, and you are so charismatic that every man and woman who meets you thinks, "Gee, I want to date." Kind of thing. It's hard to keep saying no.
I know, believe me, I know.
That's the key.
That's the key.
Why people made it too easy.
And why did he put up with it?
Because he loved her.
Simple as that.
Yep.
And his personality, as you describe, he really was able to he was very even, as you describe it, and you say he was the kind of person who could just put up with megalomania very well.
Although
particularly Brecht.
Yes.
Yeah, also.
When he was alone with Lenya or writing letters to her, because they were sometimes separated for various reasons, then it's interesting when you look at their letters collection, letters to each other, is they're going off on everybody except Moss Hart. Moss Hart was beloved by everyone. And he was a great collaborator with Weill, too. He was fast and full of ideas, appreciated and admired him. And in Lenya's book, if you appreciated and admired her husband, you were okay. She went on tour she was in a show by Maxwell Anderson with Helen Hayes, Candle in the Wind, and she went on tour with the company, and she could not stand Helen Hayes. Because a lot of
everybody loved Helen Hayes.
Not everybody, just the people who hadn't worked with her
Well,
yet.
what was the thing about Helen Hayes?
Why did she hate Helen Hayes?
Because Helen Hayes was about yay high and really cute, and she had a big following too, and she had a gift, although it was an old-fashioned gift, so she wasn't respected by, for instance, Eva Le Gallienne, who was kind of pre-method in her honest approach. But Helen Hayes, under that guise, had the strongest will since Attila the Hun. I mean, she was indomitable, but in her quiet, charming, manipulative way, and it drove everyone else crazy, because she always had the best spot on stage, and she always had the great entrance. And when she exited, she took everything with her, including the grand piano, and it kind of left everyone else in the lurch. So people who worked with her didn't like her. And actors who had a very honest, realistic approach to acting didn't like her, because they found her very fake and mannered kind of thing. But after this tour, and she would drive you crazy, but she would say, "Today the company is going to tour the local zoo." And who wanted to go to the local zoo? But
not Lotte Lenya.
Lotte
Lenya. And you had to go. But later on, Helen Hayes recorded, this was in the 78 days, of course, some patriotic, I don't remember now, verses, I guess it was, and Weill arranged the music around it so that she could not chant them, I guess, to claim them. But there was music there, because she wasn't a singer, exactly. So, and she was very proud of it, and it did very, very well. And she loved working with Weill, which is how he pronounced his name at that point.
Oh, I
everyone
thought it was Weill.
It was Weill in Germany.
Americanized it.
He Americanized it in great determination. And after that, Lotte Lenya loved Helen Hayes, because if you loved Kurt, then that was it.
Let me ask you, I mean, you're a music historian as well. Do you detect in listening to Weill or Weill's work a change in this type of songs he's writing when Lenya comes into his life? She does become an inspiration for a lot of things.
Absolutely, but it happened at the same time as when he met Brecht. Before that, he was one of Germany's enfants terribles. In fact, he's one of the two main ones. The other was Paul Hindemith. And in those days, in Germany, if you wanted to be an enfant terrible, you had to write atonally, because that was the intellectuals kind of music. Down with Schubert, down with melody. What we want is, but it wasn't getting him anywhere. He wrote 3 one-act operas, like the 2 Kaiser ones, for instance, in that form. And as witness to what I'm saying, all of Kurt Weill's works are being rediscovered and constantly played street scene and now becoming a repertory item. But those 3 works are
Those
ignored
are much later,
because they're not. They're wonderful in the way he dramatizes, but atonal music can only take you so far. And there are a couple of masterpieces like Wozzeck, but basically it's not what people like to hear. And at the same time, he meets Brecht and he meets Lenya, and the Threepenny Opera comes along, and suddenly it's the Kurt Weill Cabaret, and it's completely different music. But he always had it in him because his mentor was Ferruccio Busoni, who was one of the last great melodists in German music.
I get from your book, and I also got a little from the Love music, the play that
Hal Prince
Prince directed,
about it,
that he was this very confident composer, but sort of meekish in his personality, and that he was so happy with this babe, even though, and then they had this thing where she'd be running off to...
Well, he wasn't meek. He was withdrawn.
Withdrawn.
But inside, he was very busy, very alert. Always, he was not the absent-minded professor at all.
What did he say to her? You know you're second to my music.
Lenya, you know you always come right after my music. Because she had become the music widow when they got married, because he would work in the morning, and then it was lunchtime, and she'd fix him whatever you fix in Germany in like 1927 or something. And he would have lunch and talk about his music.
Right.
And then he'd go back to composing.
And she'd run off and screw somebody. All right,
well,
so,
not necessarily right then, but he was thinking, and then it's time for dinner, and she fixes him dinner, and they have dinner, and he talks about his music, and he goes back to the piano kind of thing.
Off.
And when
she hasn't got a date,
she says, "I don't have any kind of life," because her career had slowed up greatly. By that time, she was an actress, not a dancer, and she never really was thought of as a singer, despite the fact that she was in the Threepenny Opera and a theater version, shall we say, of the opera Mahagoni, because she couldn't have sung it really in the original keys. So they kind of made a dialogue and different keys version of it to play in Berlin, kind of thing.
Right, and as you say, we don't...
But she wasn't thought of as a singer in those days.
Until she became the widow Weill, and then started to do she did the Threepenny Opera off Broadway.
Yes, that was her great comeback. Was the 1954 Theatre de Lys, this legendary. It's fair to call it. Normally, I like legendary for Paul Bunyan and the Golden Fleece, but this really is let people speak about it so often.
In this book, you're chronicling really the history of European culture. It's far beyond just the story of Weill and Lenya. But you go back and you talk about how Brecht smashed the Wagnerian style in German theater, and with the Threepenny Opera. Talk about that.
The Wagnerian thing was more and more and more to submerge the audience in this dream, because theater isn't real. You always know you're sitting in a theater, but to make it as real as possible so that it's romanticizing the very notion of theater going. No longer will the lights be on so that people can follow the show with their librettos, which they used to do in those days, or even scope the house, fan themselves, chat, whatnot. The theater he built by right, especially for his operas, and only his operas are done there even today. The whole theater is it's plunged into darkness. When the curtains part, you're submerged in this dream. Even though real life doesn't have people singing, "Oh, you know that that's not your neighbor," for instance.
Forging a sword for 3 hours and singing about it.
Exactly.
But you said they were in musical transcendence. That they were completely wrapped up, that the audience was be one.
And you're supposed to really become one with the work, and it's like a dream that becomes, it's mythology that becomes real. It's a return to some sort of ideal that I think never really existed, but Wagner thought it was the Greek.
It's some primordial feeling inside you that the music is
you become one really with the presentation, but Brecht, it's just the opposite.
Alienation,
the alienation, which doesn't mean to put you off. It means that you're always aware that it's a presentation, that the actors can directly address you, kind of thing, and no one is supposed to act. It used to drive him crazy later in his career, when he was still in America before he went back to Europe, is that the method was all over the place in the 1940s. Everyone wanted motivation, and why am I doing this, and what is it all about, and organic. and the truth and the arc, the journey that I make. He said, stop making a journey.
stop making a
Just
journey.
pronounce the words. Tell
right.
the audience what. There's a story. I used it in the book, but I got it from James Lyon, who got it from Abe Burrows. Abe Burrows, before he wrote any musicals, this is before Guys and Dolls, which was his first, he was a radio writer at the time. Duffy's Tavern was.
Oh, yes.
And he got hooked up with Brecht for one of Brecht's plays, and Brecht wanted him, because he still wasn't that good in English, he wanted Abe Burrows to write the lyrics to a song in the show. It was Galileo. And of course, although he hadn't written for the theater yet, Burrows was an American, and he was brought up in the theater tradition in musicals or plays with music. What is the point of view of the character who's singing the number? Can't Help Lovin' That Man, for instance, or Rose's Turn. Everything is about the person who is expressing. So he said to Brecht, and what's the point of view? Brecht said, he has no point of view, just write the lyrics. And Abe Burrows said, no, I mean, like for instance, this is a ballad singer singing a ballad about Galileo. Does he like Galileo? He doesn't know him, said Brecht. Well, but does he like the idea of Galileo? He doesn't know what the idea is. And Brecht kept saying, no. And finally Burrows said, but why is he singing the song? And Brecht said, because I want him to. And that's the idea. It's the opposite of Wagner.
Right.
You're kept at an intellectual remove from the work so that you can, almost academically, receive the ideas that Brecht wants to work with.
And then it's so interesting that he could work with Weill because he really mistrusted music. He mistrusted the influence of music.
Especially after Threepenny Opera
Yeah.
became this phenomenal hit because of the music. Everywhere you went in Berlin, the music of Threepenny Opera was the wallpaper, but people were not quoting the libretto that Brecht had written.
And also they were enjoying the tunes without getting the point of it, which was a very cynical,
Exactly.
tough
And yet-
attack on
Plus,
the
you're
political.
not supposed to enjoy the tune in Brecht.
That's right.
You're supposed to receive the tune.
And yet then when they went on to write Mahagoni, which was this all being during the Weimar Republic and the rise of the Third Reich, that Mahagoni, the Nazis were so bothered by the libretto that they picketed it and destroyed
Oh,
it.
worse, there was a full-scale riot. But what's interesting is the stories never jive. Like there's one story where the riot broke out at a certain point. Another story is, no, it was not till the end. In another story, the whole theater, there was like this seething cauldron of Nazi, we're going to. And another one, it was all quiet in the street. So you never really know. I guess people do not remember. I know people who can't remember, what color pants they're wearing, if they don't look down, sort of thing. So how do you expect people to remember like 40 years later, 30 years later? So it's very tricky.
But when you're going through the letters, do you find things that are, this happened yesterday, Kurt
Yes,
writes in
also
his
it's
letter.
great to see where they are at different times, because he's often, and by the way, he cheated too. It's not that, he wasn't simply, in Hollywood, for instance, he would get involved with starlets because, what's that famous definition of a starlet in Hollywood? Any woman under the age of 25 who is not actively employed in a brothel. So there are a lot of starlets that Kurt Weill could meet and have, an adventure with. And at one point, this is in Jens Rostek's book, Lenya had to make a trip from New York to Hollywood to confront her husband about a Swiss Mädchen
she
that he was
did.
seeing. And this is, and she wrote a letter to Rita Weill. That's how we know about this. The letter has survived. Rita being Kurt's sister. And there's this tricky situation where the most cheating woman on earth is confronting her husband. How dare you cheat
on
Well,
me.
you can imagine what he had
Hello,
to say about
Pot.
that.
I didn't mean to, heaven forfend I be moralistic, but the point, I was just so dazzled by her track record. But he had one too. Now you go Mahagoni smash. Things are big trouble in Germany, and they all had to leave.
Well, give us the sense of when they realized they had to get out, how they got out, all that kind
Well,
of
you have to remember that, now we know that once the Nazis got into power, which was January 30th, 1933, the famous Machtergreifung, once that happened, then, things went for all the enemies of the Third Reich downhill very quickly from there. But at the time, you have to remember that the various governments of Germany, they would be on for like 2 months.
They would come and go,
collapse,
yeah.
and the other kind of thing. So most people thought
If
they're
this will
probably not
pass.
going to stay because these people are even weirder than the ones we
And
had.
it's going to pass.
But Brecht had to leave immediately because he knew he was on the list. Kind of thing. Weill waited. He had actually a show coming up. He had his last opera, The Silver Lake, was coming up.
Right.
And also he didn't feel he was in imminent danger. But The Silver Lake really was, everyone says, that was the last act of Weimar art. It was short. It was like 2 months after, maybe a month after the Nazi takeover. And at that point, and like to remind everybody, Hitler was not elected. Hitler was appointed. Everyone keeps saying Hitler was elected. He was not elected.
appointed chancellor.
He lost his election, exactly. But the chancellor was appointed by Hindenburg, who was the president. That's what Hitler had been running for, and he did lose.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm glad we had that footnote. And now, where were we?
So Silver Lake, and after that, what begins to dawn on him where he says, I got to get out of here?
Right about then, I would say. It's after Silver Lake. I mean, in one version, he gets a phone call from someone in government, leave.
Oh, really?
Yes, but I don't know if that really happened. No one really does. The point is, things were getting very, very, very dangerous. And Brecht had left too. That must have made an impression on him. Other people had left. A lot of people went to Czechoslovakia because, in Prague, everyone spoke German.
Yeah.
Very few people spoke.
And he went to Paris.
He went to Paris.
Yeah.
He got in a car. Apparently he was driven by Caspar Neyer, who was the set designer kind of thing, and also had collaborated with him on an opera called Die Bürgschaft. And I think the Neyers drove him, and we don't know whether they let him off at the border to sneak, past some prop trees, or he just went the normal way kind of thing. But he was and he believed, as many people did, that France would be okay kind of thing, and wait and see if the Third Reich would collapse.
Let's see if
kind of
that's the
thing.
end of it.
The trouble was, France was just as anti-Semitic as Germany was at the time. It was not that great and he did go to England for a show, A Kingdom for a Cow. And what's interesting to me is, yes, he did in 1935, he went to America, but it was not out of a fear that Europe was going to be dangerous for him, which indeed was the case. It was because he had gotten a commission for a show.
Now, how do you compare, because we're running out of time and this is such a fascinating book, but I want to get to this. How do you compare how Weill and with him Lenya, who joined back up with him in England, right?
No, in actually France.
In France.
We should just say, by the way, that she was away, right? I mean, when he was leaving,
when he
she
left,
was off
yes.
with the
She was
tenor.
exactly, Otto Pozzetti.
But how Weill adapted in the United States, compare that with how Brecht adapted in the United States.
Brecht did not adapt. Brecht does not adapt. The world adapts to Brecht. Brecht, in fact, ended up in Los Angeles, as so many people did. And Thomas Mann was there, and Thomas Mann said, "Where I am, Germany is." But Brecht did not see Germany where Thomas Mann was. He called Los Angeles Tahiti with boulevards or something like that. He was miserable unless he was in a cultural capital that was German-speaking, that would give him a theater. That he could run himself, and that's what he finally ended up with in East Berlin.
But Weill, meanwhile, came to America, and this was the beginning of a whole new career.
Yes, and he determined to become as American as possible. He changed the pronunciation of his last name, not the spelling, but now it's Weill. He's Kurt Weill.
Yeah.
He spoke German as seldom as possible, kind of thing. He did still write to his parents who had gone to Palestine. He wrote to them in German, but otherwise, you really had to speak English if you wanted to speak.
And he folded himself into the Broadway world.
He did, although I have to say, everyone always loves to say, there's the fabulous Brechtian Weill of Germany, and then there's this guy in America doing the mambo with Moss Hart and having hit tunes and so on. That is absolutely not the case there. Lotte Lenya said there's only one Weill, and Ethan Mordden says it too. Or there are 30 Weills, because every one of his works, except for Happy End, which was an attempt to do another three-penny opera. Every one of his works is different from every other work, and it's one drive line of his constantly trying to perfect the notion of music theater that will be as musical as opera, but as theatrical as theater kind of thing. And he believes he finally hit it in Street Scene, which is one of his very, very last works in 1947.
But before that, he had the September song.
Yes, there was such a delay in getting the show that he had come to America to do, which was this big biblical opera kind of thing, The Eternal Road, that he got involved with the group theater. He did the pacifist piece Johnny Johnson, then he did Knickerbocker Holiday, he did Lady in the Dark. That was when he really, that was an amazing, that was one of the biggest hits that Broadway has ever seen, because Gertrude Lawrence in that show, and there were so many interesting things. It's about a woman undergoing psychoanalysis, of course, and it's a play.
And Moss Hart was obsessed with psychoanalysis.
He was, that's why. But at that time, psychoanalysis was very, very little understood. Very few people knew about it. So it was very trendy to go and find out about what it's like, when you lie on the couch and the doctor says, "I am listening." Which is your cue to start.
Well, they always said about Moss Hart, he really was the Lady in the Dark.
But remember, too, it wasn't, yes, that's true, but it wasn't a musical. It's a play with 3 dreams that are operas, and then 1 song kind of thing. So there are all these crazy things, such as Gertrude Lawrence does not, very, very big star, remember, she does not have a star entrance. She walks in almost immediately and very plain. Not the glamorous Gertrude Lawrence, but, with glasses and looking kind of mousy and so on. And she's on the couch, and he says, Moss Hart's favorite line, "I am listening." That was originally the title of the show, by the way. And as she starts to talk about this dream she had, in this magical transformation of the sets, the psychiatrist's office disappears, and this glamour dream turns up. And she is the queen of New York, and everyone is just amazed by her. And of course, she's made this complete change of costume and makeup and so on. And now she is the Queen of Broadway, as we knew she would be. But the trouble is that in the cabaret that she goes to, they're going to paint her portrait for the new stamp. And when she sees the portrait, she screams because she has this problem. But then there's this big number and everyone is dancing around. And what you don't see is she's sneaking off stage and there's a double in her costume who's dancing with everyone else. And she's getting back into that first costume. So then when the dream vanishes and suddenly there she is. The town was amazed by this show. Not just by Kurt Weill's music, which is fabulous, but the whole thing.
Staging.
Moss figured this whole thing out, and he did not actually direct it. It was Hazard Short who directed it, but Moss was the muscle behind this thing. And once Lady in the Dark came along, Kurt Weill was made. And Brecht, over in Los Angeles, is trying to figure out a way to get back into this guy's life because he can put on anything he wants.
So, Ethan, we're dead out of time.
Just
You're
tell
so
us
fascinating.
but just tell us one quick thing. So Lotte does Lenya does come back to him.
Yes, before they go to America.
Yeah, and then he dies, and she has a whole nother career as the most famous James Bond villain, arguably, of all time, Rosa Klebb.
Yep.
And it's all in the book. It's all in the book. It's a wonderful, wonderful book to read.
The book is called Love Song, The Lives of Kurt Weill, I've learned now to say properly, and Lotte Lenya by Ethan Mordden. And it is Weill. We now call him Kurt Weill. We don't call him Kurt Weill anymore.
When he died, he was Kurt Weill.
Okay, all
Not
right.
Kurt Weill.
All right. An excellent book. Thanks a lot for being our guest on.
Thank you.
On Theater Talk, Ethan. Good to see you. You can sign up for viewer updates at theatertalk.org.
Or you can follow us on Twitter. Our thanks to the Friends of Theater Talk for their significant contribution to this production. Theater Talk is made possible in part by the Frederick Lowe Foundation, the Eleanor Naylor Dana Charitable Trust, the Alan S. Gordon Foundation, the CORY and Bob Donnelly Charitable Fund, Carrie J. Fries, the Dorothy STRELSIN Foundation, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and the New York State Council on the Arts, a state agency.
We welcome your questions or comments for Theater Talk. Thank you and good night.